Hello again. Today is the fifth Sunday in Lent. It's also known as Passion Sunday. Now, when we hear the words passion or passionate, very often we think about someone's drive or zeal for a particular cause, hobby, the arts maybe. Or more likely, we'll think of people getting particularly amorous. Passion's that moment when we are so caught up and we are burning and we are lost to the world. So much so is our mind wrapped around whatever it is we're passionate about. But actually the words passion and passionate come from the Latin word passio, which means suffering. And so with that in mind, we come to realise and remember that actually, even in those moments of excitement and drivenness, there is a kind of suffering too. As they say, agony and ecstasy aren't always that far apart. Now, the last few hours and the death of Jesus are also known as his passion, the suffering of Jesus. And so in Passiontide, these last 2 weeks of Lent, we spend more time reflecting on that suffering and on the suffering of the world more generally. We're called to be compassionate. Now, most of us will have heard or used the word compassion before. It's a word for caring for someone, for being sympathetic towards a particular situation. But in reality, the word has a deeper meaning than that. It means to suffer with someone, to truly understand and to know and to share their pain, their suffering. Such an important thing to do, and yet one that's so hard. Throughout his life, Jesus demonstrated his compassion for us through his incarnation, through becoming one of us, a human being, showing that he wanted to know and understand humanity's pains and sufferings, wanted to be bound by that narrower perspective on existence that comes with being mortal. And we read in the Gospels how deeply grieved Jesus was at the suffering of those around us, and how angry he became with those who increased the burdens of their neighbours. And of course today we hear the example par excellence, Jesus' grief with Mary and Martha at the death of their brother Lazarus, his tears, and of course his raising Lazarus from the grave, all of it true compassion. Now that compassion at Lazarus' death points us forward to looking at Jesus' own death and resurrection, and his desire to share that resurrection with each and every one of us. Our resurrection will be the final and greatest act of love and compassion. It's why it is the corner and keystone of our faith. Without that hope, well, we're all wasting our time. Now, each evening in Lent at evening prayer, we've heard the verse, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. That's from the first letter of St. Peter, chapter 2, verse 21. And it's a call for us to be compassionate in a twofold way. Firstly, we are called to suffer with Christ. We are to take this time at the end of Lent to finish reflecting on what we have done and what we need to improve in our lives, to spend more time reflecting on what Christ has done and what that means for our lives. As we approach the sacred days at the end of Lent, we need to feel the pain of them more keenly, because that, like nothing else, will help us to drive our spiritual lives forward. We may not be able to celebrate and experience the full grandeur of the liturgies of Maundy Thursday through to Good Friday and into Easter Vigil like we normally do, but that doesn't mean we're going to do faith light. Far from it. That deprivation is part of our suffering that we can unite with Christ's. Secondly, of course, we are to suffer with those around us. And these days there is so much suffering going on around us. There's the suffering of those who have contracted coronavirus, their friends, their families, and those who mourn for those who have died from it, but also those who are working in fear, those who have lost their jobs or who are worrying about losing their jobs, for those who are increasingly going without food or the necessities of life because of the selfishness of others. Not to mention all the usual suffering that's still going on in the world, but which seems to have been quietly forgotten. More than ever, we need to be compassionate. More than ever, we need to be prepared to suffer with one another and not simply sympathise. Now, for a lot of people in our world who don't have faith, one of the main reasons for that is the question of suffering. If there is a God, and if that God is all good and all powerful, why then is there suffering? It's a good question, but I wouldn't say it's a good reason not to believe in God. After all, that then means that we can't shout at him about it. Actually, I think there are perhaps three types of suffering. Things we do to each other, things we do to ourselves, and then those other things that are beyond the realm of human cause. But God doesn't cause suffering. God doesn't enjoy suffering. God doesn't want suffering. God wants to show us his love and compassion. Ultimately, most suffering is caused by people, by those same people that God has given freedom and the ability to make choices. Because all of our choices have consequences, either for ourselves or for those around us, immediately or sometime in the future. Why do so many people suffer around the world? Suffer the effects of coronavirus, say? Is it because God hasn't waved a magic wand? Or is it because people decided that they knew better and ignored advice that they were given? Of course, some suffering is inexplicable, is groundless, and to reflect on that, we should read Job at some point. But what we must try and remember is that suffering is not a punishment to us, and neither actually is death. Suffering, handled well, can bring physical and spiritual growth. Now, if we want our muscles to grow, if we want to have, big biceps or strong abs, we need to exercise them. We need to put them under strain, to cause them some suffering and damage, so that as the blood vessels repair, they expand and grow. A natural pearl is created when a tiny little parasite gets into the shell of some poor unsuspecting mollusk. Now that mollusk, naturally irritated by the intruder, covers it with layer upon layer of calcium carbonate to ease the irritation, and so produces a pearl. When we unite our sufferings with those of others and with Christ, we grow spiritually because we remember our fragility, our need for God, and of course our own inability to command our destiny. And so letting go to that, our faith grows stronger. So I would encourage you, be open to suffering, to feeling deeply the suffering of Jesus, of others, and of course yourself. Shielding yourself from pain won't make it go away. It will just make it harder to bear. But embracing it, harnessing it, struggling with it even, will help lead to a better life for you and for everyone, long after Easter and certainly long after coronavirus. May God bless you and keep you. May you always know his comforting presence with you in your suffering. Amen.